Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today in War Thunder, what we're going to be talking about is another British heavy bomber, or medium bomber, depending on where you sit on the idea of what a heavy bomber is. But this is basically a two-engine Lancaster. I think it's probably the easiest way of me describing it to people who maybe aren't as familiar with RAF Bomber Command as some of the others out there. And it's kind of a surprise that we haven't seen it in the game yet, especially now that we have two Sunderlands, two Stirlings, two Lancasters, a Halifax, a Lincoln, all of these wonderful aircraft. But one that is missing, as well as the Whitley of course missing, is the Avro Manchester. Now, the Avro Manchester is one of those planes which, once again, was a very good plane, but was overshadowed by some of its bomber brethren around it, mainly the Halifax, to be quite honest. And so what we're going to do today is look into its history, and then afterwards talk about why, in my opinion, it should be put in the game. I mean, there isn't really an argument against it. It was made in a decent amount. It was seen to be effective. And since we already have planes which have a similar role in the British tree already, then it shows that there is place for that role itself. So let's get into it. So the Avro Manchester was a pretty successful attempt by, of course, the Avro firm to fulfill the Air Ministry specification P13/36. The specification called for a twin-engine heavy bomber that could support a multi-purpose payload of bombs or torpedoes, so pretty much a kind of jack of all trades large bomber. Instead of creating different aircraft which could do different jobs, they wanted a much more odd job man in that sense. So obviously the aircraft at the time, such as the Handley Page Halifax being a 4-engine bomber, would not be able to meet that specification, even though it was designed for that specification, which is kind of interesting. The Manchester itself would actually have a shortened production run, short-term service life and operational service, which had, of course, engine troubles, which, if you know anything about Bomber Command, is something that happened all the way through the war, especially with specific aircraft. I'm looking at you, Halifax, I'm looking at you, Whitley, I'm looking at you, Wellington, and of course the Manchester, and many others at the time. In the end, only about 209 Manchesters would ever actually be completed, with the production split between Avro and also Metropolitan Vickers, Avro making 177 and Metropolitan Vickers making 32. Now, 209 may not seem like a lot, but compared to some aircraft in the game, such as prototypes or planes, or paper planes, which not even one full one was built, I think 209 is a pretty decent number. So outwardly, the Manchester was very similar to other multi-engine Avro aircraft in the Second World War. So this would be the Avro Lincoln, the Shackleton, and of course the Lancaster itself. Something that you may have seen from the pictures is the nose of the plane looks incredibly similar to the Lancasters, and yes, that's because it basically was. I will go into the Shackleton another day. I feel like that is something that should get its own video. The twin engines were underslung on the mid-mounted monoplane wings. It also had dihedral outboards of the engines and also the main wheel undercarriage. The fuselage itself was mostly straight and slender design from nose to tail. The flight deck was maintained. The flight deck itself maintained a good all-around vantage point and featured extensive framing for obviously structural strength and helping out the crew. The empennage was dominated by the identifiable twin vertical fin arrangement common to the other Avro designs. So once again, if you want to... That's why I said, if you're unfamiliar with Bomber Command and all the bombers coming out of Britain, the best way to look at it is take a Lancaster in game, make it slightly smaller, take off 2 engines. That's basically what the Manchester is. The initial production variant of the Manchester also had a 3rd vertical tail fin running between the base 2 and along the rear portion of the upper fuselage, so that would be kind of a little nifty design we could have if they wanted to put more than one variant of the thing in the game. The rear fuselage as well also extended out beyond this assembly, and this held the rear gunner's position. So he was kind of left on an island out there, which, well, I suppose as tail gunners and also ball turrets out of B-17s, it can definitely feel quite lonely in those spaces. The crew accommodations meant that you could carry up to 7 personnel, and the aircraft itself was defended by 8 7.7mm Browning machine guns in different emplacements. So you had 2 fitted in the nose turret, while the tail turret mounted 4 of these 7.7mm, and the remaining 2 were positioned in a dorsal turret mounted to the rearward position of the fuselage. So what you basically have here is 2 in the front and 6 looking back, with 2 on the top. That means that going after this aircraft from behind is going to be quite dangerous. Going at it from above is not going to be as dangerous, but still a little bit. Going at it from the front is probably the best way to do it. And in general, against British bombers, the way you should approach them in game is, well, below them, if you can, and if you're not able to do that, from the side. Just because generally the front and back turrets do not have the coverage to be able to cover the full side, so coming at it from a straight 90-degree angle perpendicular to the fuselage, slightly below, will mean that no guns will actually be able to hit you. Moving on, from an offensive standpoint, so the bomber itself, the Manchester, was able to carry 10,350 pounds of internally held bombs or torpedoes. So, something that is interesting is the fact that this thing, as due to specification, could not just hold bombs, it could also hold torpedoes, and with the naval ships hopefully eventually coming into open beta test, that means that torpedoes will become more useful. Now yes, the Manchester is huge, and it's going to be very obvious to a destroyer when it is near. You know, torpedoes are still kind of useful, as long as they're not the ones on the Wellington, where you pretty much have to be cutting your engines at 100 meters before you're able to drop them, but I'm pretty sure they will be, unfortunately. The production model specifications were pretty lacking in the actual speed department. The top reported speed of the aircraft was 250 miles per hour, and a range of 1,200 miles and a service ceiling of just under 20,000 feet, so really nothing spectacular there. The Manchester was powered by twin Rolls-Royce Vulture 24-cylinder X-type engines, and they each had 1,500 horsepower. They were initially reported to have 1,760 horsepower, but this was eventually lowered after more testing. This selection of power plants would eventually become the Manchester's undoing, though, as the engines had a nasty tendency to catch fire when in flight. And obviously, if you're in the middle of the air, let's say you're over the English Channel or France on a night mission, well, let's just say your engine's catching fire is kind of a bad thing. Not just because obviously it means your engines are going to die and you may crash and have to parachute out, but also because it lights you up in the middle of the night, and a lot of these bombers were designed to be useful in a night bomber mode and also during daylight bombing. So yeah, that is something to always consider. The same issue greeted the Halifax as well. As I said, that was something that plagued the Halifax, and the Halifax also, I believe it was nicknamed the Brewing Kettle. sometimes, or at least from who I've talked to, like reading some memoirs. At least some bomber crews called it the brewing kettle, because it would just decide one day that it was going to set alight. And this basically meant that it forced the Halifax to become a 4-engine bomber, which utilized the Rolls-Royce Merlin 10 series of engines. And Avro continued the Manchester design with the Vulture series. By the series operation run, no fewer than 30 Manchesters were lost to engine failures, effectively forcing the bomber out of service. So just to put that into perspective, let's just get a calculator up here, because I can give a rough estimate, but I feel like it's just better to not do that. So out of the 209 which were built, approximately 14%, 14.354, so 14.4% of these Manchesters were lost to engine failures, which, you know, maybe for some other nations that is not a lot, or maybe if you're running a prototype and maybe it has a few dodgy engines, or you're working on a new engine, that's not too bad. But when you're talking about a fully produced aircraft which is supposed to fill out a mission, yeah, losing 14% of your fighting power, not even to the enemy, is just obviously not good for the bomber command of the RAF. The first Manchester prototype was named the L7246. This actually first flew on the 25th of July 1939. This aircraft was followed by a second prototype, which went airborne on the 26th of May 1940. And the early Manchester sported a central tail fin, which we talked about before, and this gave the aircraft a unique appearance in sporting 3 of these surfaces. The Manchester then entered production after testing in this form as the Manchester Mark I model series, but was delivered in only 20 cases, so pretty much 20 Manchester Mark I's were built. The Mark I aircraft joined the 207 Squadron in November 1940, and its first mission came about on the 24th of February 1941. The Manchester Mark A's soon followed, and there was about 200 total examples of this aircraft. These Manchesters differed in that their central tail fin was removed in favor of enlarging the remaining 2 tail fins. So in this form, the Manchester would be the most remembered. This was basically the main production variant of it. But there are 2 variants of the Manchester which you could add in. So at the height of its operational use, these 200 or so Manchester bombers, they formed 8 bomber squadrons and were utilized by RAF Coastal Command. The last Manchester mission was recorded on the 25th of June 1942. Surprise! No, that's not my birthday. I don't know why I said that. Never mind, moving on. The production ended almost pretty much as soon as it began, wrapping up in November 1941. I mean, if your plane just keeps failing when it comes to its engines, it's either fix the engines or, you know, you've got to do something about it. But anyway, we have the Manchester II. The Manchester II appeared as a proposed and improvised model version of the Manchester series. These would have sported twin Bristol Centaurus or Napier Sabre engines to make up for the deficiencies inherent in the Rolls-Royce Vulture brand engines, which were used in the production of the Manchesters. But unfortunately for Manchester, and also the company Avro, this model series was never produced. So they tried to address the issues that were coming, with the Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. But unfortunately, they just were never produced. Maybe they didn't get a contract, maybe the Air Ministry just decided that there was no need for it and all of this stuff. So yeah, maybe they just didn't want the same issues happening once again with the engines. So a single Manchester Mark I was pulled aside to undergo conversion to a new Manchester 3 standard. And this new model design, the BT308, featured a greater wingspan incorporating the power of 4 engines, but still retaining the 3 vertical tail surfaces of the original Manchester. The first flight of the recently dubbed Lancaster aircraft was achieved on the 9th of January 1941, and then a follow-up model, the DG595, was debuted shortly thereafter, and featured the enlarged twin vertical tail fins of the Manchester 1A. So this Manchester 3 would essentially become the prototype of the Avro Lancaster series of multi-engine heavy bombers. So even though the Manchester in service really had a lot of issues, what it actually did was birth a plane which a lot see to be the workhorse of the bomber command of the RAF, flying multitudes of missions and being the centerpiece of many parades nowadays, showing its use in World War II. For me personally, I still think the biscuit goes to the Halifax for that role, but that is just through my reading and also maybe a bit of personal bias. Canada, surprisingly, became the only other Manchester operator during its service life, and the Manchester, all in all, if we actually look at it reasonably and logically, it was a failed project, but the evolution of the system, the fact that it was able to produce the Lancaster bomber, which became this whole, basically the backbone of the RAF bomber groups, if you take away the Halifax, it basically means that it was not in vain, and that is something that I believe should be represented in the game. So when we talk about where should it be in War Thunder, well, that is an interesting question. Right now, if we look at something like a Halifax, I feel like a lot of the British bombers in-game have some very odd BRs around them, and trying to work out where to put them is not as easy as can be. But working out where to put them might not be as easy as you may think, especially when we look at the game modes such as realistic. Now, for me personally, when I look at the Manchester, what I see is quite a slow aircraft with okay armament, but still not great armament, which won't suffer from the main issues that it struggled with in World War II, mainly the engines just dying randomly. Gaijin have talked about many times in the past they don't want to put, real life failures in the game when it comes to issues with the engine and stuff like that, because obviously you don't want to spawn in and your engines don't work in the middle of the air, just like you don't want to spawn in a tank and your turret ring just stops working, stuff like that. So, because of that, I feel this could be a good stopgap between the Wellingtons and the Halifax. I feel like it could really fit in there, especially the 2 variants, which are very similar to each other. I think just putting 1 variant in would be fine, but if they decide to put in 2, they would fit in that nice little snug gap between the Wellingtons and the Halifax. But I'm just happy if we get more British bombers. That is what I find really interesting, mainly about World War II. It's how I got into it. It's how I decided to start reading more about it, the bombing campaigns, and also because of all the Yorkshire airfields where I was born. It was just interesting to me. So to see something like a Manchester in-game alongside a lot of its brothers that are already here would be a wonderful sight. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.